Hi there, this is George R. R. Martin. I'm the author of The Pointy End, the episode that we're about to view. And of course, I'm also the author of A Game of Thrones, the novel, first volume of A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the series of fantasy novels that the show is based on. So I have sort of a double threat here. I was the person who provided the underlying material being adapted, and the one doing the adaptation, which sometimes creates a strange conflict of interest for a writer or a screenwriter. Back in the days when I first started working in television on the CBS revival of The Twilight Zone from the mid-'80s, Phil DeGuerre, who ran the show, would never let any of us adapt our own stories because he always felt the original writer was too close to make the necessary changes. But fortunately, that's not the case with David Benioff and Dan Weiss and the folks at HBO, so I was able to have a role in the adaptation and do one script per season for the show. The credit sequence that you're watching now is something that I've loved since I first saw it. One of the big things about fantasy is, of course, it takes place in an imaginary realm. And the geography is very important. So getting the map in right at the beginning to establish where these places are is a terrific idea. The sequence picks up immediately after the end of the last episode, where the Lannisters are moving against Ned Stark. The king is dead, so it's all taking place practically simultaneously with the end of the last episode. All of the Stark men being slaughtered here. It's a lovely shot here, I think. The courage of Septa Mordane facing the men with swords. Miltos and Maisie playing Arya Stark and Syrio Forel, her dancing master, have been some of my favorites since the show began. Maisie is just amazing as Arya, and Miltos has really done an incredible job. In the books, Syrio Forel is bald, and of course, when Miltos was cast, there were a number of fans who said, he has all this hair, he's not bald. But that's the sort of trivial thing that you really shouldn't worry about when you're making an adaptation. He is Syrio. He brings the character to life wonderfully, and that's the important thing. Now, this action sequence I think is terrific, but it's one of the things where you see how the interrelated nature of doing film affects what you see on the screen. In the books, the armor of the Lannister men-at-arms is somewhat different. Their helmets are open-faced, they have a lion on top of them, and they're unarmored largely other than that. So when Sirio fights them all, he breaks a number of their knees by striking at their unprotected knees, and he also uses that wooden sword to actually kill a few by breaking their noses or driving the wooden sword through the eyes. Of course, when the armor was designed here, the Lannister guards have full face helmets, which was just sort of a different look in the early episodes, but we get to this episode, and you have to adjust the nature of the fight scene because, of course, he now can't drive his wooden sword through the eye of any of these people because they have facial protection. But the rest of the sequence is very close to the way I wrote it, both in the book and in my script, and I think they did a marvelous job on this. And here Arya makes her decision to go down instead of up. In the script, the scene goes on a little further where she actually passes through the dragon skulls, which we've seen her discover in the previous episodes. So we know that she's escaped the city because we know that passage leads out. But that was cut for reasons of time here. And it's followed by that beautiful scene between the Hound, Sandor Clegane, and Sansa. And here, of course, Arya is finding her sword, Needle, which has been packed away for the girl's return to Winterfell. And Arya's first kill. I do miss, in the book, when the stable boy is stared, he says, take it out. Sort of a sad, plaintive little line. And of course, when she takes it out, he dies. And that was in the script, but I gather it was not used for some reason. I rather miss that. I like that line. I think the set that they're using here is actually the same set that they used for the Crypts of Winterfell in the earlier episodes that were set up north. They've removed the statues of the dead kings and all that, but they're using the same subterranean set to be the black cells under the Red Keep of King's Landing. In the books, one thing about Varys is that he is a master of disguise, and in his youth, he is a mummer, which is an actor, so to speak, and learned certain tricks of disguise and of taking on other identities. So in court, he is the perfumed eunuch, frequently in robes with powdered face, very soft, very effeminate, playing that role. But down in the dungeons, he has a whole separate identity as Rugen, a jailer, who in the books wears a iron cap, and he has a kind of a gruff, stubbly beard, which of course is artificial makeup, so to speak, a medieval makeup that they put on, just to give him a different appearance. They've simplified that here, obviously. Varys is not in his court robes, but he's not in his full Rugen persona either. I love the way Sean reacts to that, just with his face, showing the impact that that revelation has on him. And that "not today" that he delivers is an interesting echo of "not today" that Syrio teaches Arya. All of that, the "not today" riff was added by David Benioff and Dan Weiss. Wonderful addition to the books. And now we switch to the wall. These are two of the men who rode north with Benjamin Stark when he led the ranging out. In the books, they're established a little earlier, especially Othor, the big one. And now Sam is talking a little about some anomalies about the corpses. In my original draft of the script, Sam has various other observations about the corpses, the black hands that the whites typically have. And now the news about Ned's arrest has reached the wall, and Jon Snow is about to hear some of it. One of the characters from the books who's missing in the series is Lord Commander Mormont's Raven, who is a very old raven, almost a pet, who's constantly with him in the books and who can talk. Although his talking mostly consists of repeating a word or phrase that he's heard recently. The Raven is a somewhat controversial character, I guess, in the book, and some of my fans love him and wrote me, said, "Oh, why did they leave out the Raven? I really liked the Raven." And other of my readers said, "Thank God they got rid of that annoying Raven. Boy, he's my least favorite part of the books. He's always breaking in to say corn, corn." So whether the Raven will ever show up, I don't know. This whole scenario here where Sansa, just so wonderfully played by Sophie Turner, is being confronted by the Queen and the men of the King's Small Council. The reader is supposed to get the impression that it's all been rehearsed. I mean, Sansa doesn't twig to that, but certainly the characters do. They're doing an exaggerated version here of good cop, bad cop, or good counselor, bad counselor, in order to try to manipulate Sansa into writing the letter they want, because the Lannisters certainly had to get rid of Eddard Stark to avoid him handing over the throne to Stannis. But they don't want an all-out war, not at this stage. And they're hoping still to use Sansa and Arya, if they can find her, to broker a peace. And the fact that they hold Ned, he's a very valuable hostage. So Grandmaster Pycelle is the bad cop here, and Littlefinger is the good cop. Although Littlefinger has his own motivations, let us say, which go beyond just playing his role in this scenario. I love the interplay between Lena Headey and Sophie Turner there in that scene. One of the things a television show needs to do, of course, is to move along fairly quickly. There's obviously a great amount of elapsed time that is taking place here. Sansa was writing a letter a minute ago, and now the letter has already reached Robb in Winterfell, hundreds of leagues to the north. In the book, there's more of an implication of the passage of time, but a television show with only an hour, we have to move some of this along quickly. And Richard Madden has not had much opportunity to shine in the previous episodes as Robb, but he's an incredible actor, and with this episode and the ones that follow at the end of the season, I think he really comes into his own. And there's a great dynamic here between him and Alfie Allen as Theon. Here we have the ravens taking off, which is just a little moment, but I love that moment. In the first draft of my script, I wrote a whole montage sequence there called The Calling of the Banners, where after the ravens took off, I showed the ravens being received at the Dreadfort, on Bear Island, at Last Hearth, at Carhold, and I showed all of the various secondary lords reacting to it one way or another, assembling their men, or riding out, or setting sail. It was a magnificent sequence. You know, when I handed in the first draft, David Benioff said, "George, this is great, but it would take 5 times our budget for our entire season." So the calling of the banners had to go, which I kind of expected. There was always a joke during the 10 years I worked in Hollywood that my scripts, especially my first drafts, were always too long and too expensive. And I had to maintain that tradition now, didn't I? But I write my first drafts, I don't know, for myself. And then later, subsequent drafts, when I go back, I cut and trim and eliminate things and make it producible. But in my head, in the alternate world where we have a budget of $20 million for each episode, we could do a great calling of the banners. I think it's a nice scene between the two sisters here. And now we see Bronn and Tyrion, who, having won their freedom in the trial by battle last episode, are now making their way through the Mountains of the Moon back to the Riverlands. It's established when they go to the Eyrie after Tyrion's capture that the Mountains of the Moon are very dangerous. The hill tribes are unruly, and they raid weakly defended parties, kill them or capture them. So by sending Tyrion out that way and not providing him a ship to sail from Gulltown, Lysa Tully has, in essence, expects him to die. Peter Dinklage has been incredible as Tyrion from the very first start. I mean, long ago, when we first started this project, even before HBO was involved, when I first met David Benioff and Dan Weiss over lunch one day in Los Angeles, to discuss the possibility of doing my books as a TV series. At a certain point in the proceedings, we started playing the casting game, as we often did, and saying who we saw as this role, who we saw as that role. And there was never anyone but Peter Dinklage for Tyrion. We did not read any other actors for the part. We did not audition anyone. We did not sound out anyone. The minute we started casting, it was, we have to get Peter Dinklage to play Tyrion. It's the only possible way to do it. And thankfully, we did. He is Tyrion. He's been incredible since the beginning. That's Mark Lewis Jones as Shagga, son of Dolph, who becomes ultimately one of Tyrion's staunchest supporters, along with Bronn. The dynamic between Tyrion and Bronn has always been something I've enjoyed writing about. The Hill tribes are the original owners of the Vale, as the books establish. You know, the continent of Westeros has undergone several invasions over the years. The first humans to rule Westeros were called the First Men, and then thousands of years later, the Andals came in. And the current Lords of the Vales are Andals, who, when they landed, drove the First Men, the original owners of the Vale, up into the mountains and hills, where they live a sort of meager existence ever since, but always dreaming about the lands and castles that they lost. And Tyrion knows all that, of course, so he's deliberately appealing to this desire on their part to get back to things that were taken from their great grandfathers and other forebears. And Jon has a bit of a temper. He let himself be goaded there by Sir Alliser Thorne. There's no love lost between the two of those. And attacking a superior officer is not something tolerated in the Watch, no more than it is in any military organization. So Jon is confined to quarters, and here Ghost senses that something is amiss. And yes, Ghost is making noise. A number of fans have written me about that. The purists are quite upset about that. I'm not. Ghost in the books is completely silent. One of the reasons Jon names him Ghost. He's the only one of the direwolves who makes no noise. He does not growl or bark. But I assume that Dave and Dan tried that and found a little sound would make him a little more fearsome. There are things that one can imagine when one's writing a book that work fine in the imagination of readers. But when you actually put it on screen, you discover problems with it. It perhaps doesn't get across what you want it to get across. So this is at night, darkness has fallen, and the dead men, Othor and Jafer Flowers, have both arisen. And here comes Othor, who is dead. Now, a little thing like sword through him doesn't actually stop the whites because they're dead to begin with. And indeed, that arm, that severed arm, in the book and in my first draft of the script, continues to fight itself, crawling across the floor. But fire stops him, as John correctly discerns here. So he burns his hand in it, but does manage to save the Lord Commander from the dead man. And now we're getting to the village of the Lazarine. The Dothraki tongue was something that HBO especially commissioned to have written by an organization that specializes in creation of imaginary languages. David Peterson is one of the main fellows responsible for creating it, and it's just amazing that the actors have learned to speak it and managed to convey such wonderful meaning with what are essentially made-up words. But I think it works much better with Dothraki and the subtitles than it would have if everyone was just speaking English. And Dany here is appalled by the rape and slaughter that she's seeing. Khal Drogo is moving. He's taken his Khalasar toward the sea to begin the conquest of Westeros, but it's quite a way to the sea, and of course they have to be fed, and when they reach the sea, they're going to need a way to get these ships to take them across. So slaving is one of the ways that the Dothraki earn money, although they don't look at it earn, they look at it as an exchange of gifts. The Dothraki do not actually believe in buying and selling in the same way as the more mercantile civilizations of the West. So Dany can't enact the idea of don't take slaves, but what she does there is saying, well, I'll take the slaves. I'm the queen. I'm the Khaleesi. All the slaves belong to me. And in that way, she can extend some protection over the women who were being raped. Jason Momoa is wonderful in this scene, I think. He did a terrific job as Khal Drogo all along, even though in the early episodes he has very little in the way of dialogue, and it's all physical acting. It's all his face and his eyes and his body movement. And the scene that you're about to see here is not one that I can claim credit for myself. I mean, I wrote this scene in the book up to about this point, but in the books, Mago, although he is unhappy about it, accepts the Khal's proclamation. I think it was actually Jason who came to David and Dan and said, we hear a lot about how Khal Drogo is such a magnificent fighter, but we never see him fight. So let us see him fight. That wound, which of course will be very important that he takes there, in my original draft and in the books, is given to him in the fight with the landmen, the Lazarene, and not in his fight with Mago. So there we have one of the more unforgettable, violent, and brutal moments in the show, and an action sequence that I think anybody who sees it will remember for a long, long time. I've talked sometimes in interviews about what I call the butterfly effect, which name comes from that classic Ray Bradbury short story, The Sound of Thunder, where a man steps on a butterfly in the Jurassic and changes all of history that follows. Small changes may lead to larger changes going on. And that's always a challenge in an adaptation of a series of books as long as mine. In this case, we see a little example of the butterfly effect because Mago, who just died so memorably and excitingly, does not die in the books. And in fact, as I speak, the 5th book is about to come out, and Mago is still alive. Danny has promised him later in the 1st book that he will die screaming for the things he does later on, but he hasn't died screaming yet. So this is one thing where the television series and the books do diverge in the eventual fate of the character Mago. And now we're back at Winterfell with Robb Stark and Grey Wind, his direwolf, discussing his strategy with the Great John, played by Clive Mantle, the largest and fiercest and most belligerent of the bannermen of Winterfell, Great John Umber. The Umbers are one of the more powerful of the bannermen of House Stark. Now, of course, in the books, where I have my cast of thousands, there are considerably more people taking part in this argument. The Great John is saying why he should lead the vanguard, and other people are also arguing that they should lead the vanguard. Galbert Glover, his brother Robert Glover, Roose Bolton is present, Mage Mormont, Rickard Karstark. All of these are characters, and they're implied here rather than seen. And some of them may come up in later seasons, but aside from being additional voices, they had no major part in this scene. So one of the realities of filming is you have to make decisions like that. You can't necessarily have 12 people gathering around a table, all of them with something to say. The Great John, of course, is not actually pleased to have lost his fingers, but he's pleased to find that what he thought was a mere green boy has got some stones to him. Not to mention a big, large, mean direwolf. And Isaac Hempstead Wright is another of our child actors who's, I think, come through wonderfully for the show. Of all the casting we had to do for Game of Thrones, finding the children was the hardest. And a lot of credit goes to our wonderful casting director, Nina Gold. I mean, there are a lot of children in the world who would like to be in movies or television shows, but the sad truth is that most of them simply can't act, or at least they can't act yet. When you look at, as we did, hundreds of auditions for parts like Arya and Sansa and Bran, you find a lot of cute kids who are simply reciting the lines. And, for an 8-year-old kid or a 9-year-old kid, 10-year-old kid reciting the lines, that's a considerable achievement. I don't want to denigrate that by any means, but it's not acting. They're just a kid reciting lines. And then you get a minority who go to the other extreme. They've been told that acting is emoting, so they over emote. They chew the scenery, so to speak. So we went through hundreds of actors until we found Isaac and Sophie and Arya. And once you find them, it's like finding a diamond in the rough. It's just amazing. You just look at it and say, oh my God, yes, there's what we want. And this, of course, is the youngest Stark child, Rickon. Rickon is considerably older in the TV series than he is in the books. In the books, he's only a 3-year-old. And he's not a viewpoint character, simply because it was hard enough to write from a viewpoint of an 8-year-old. I couldn't imagine writing from the viewpoint of a 3-year-old. So we've aged him up. We've aged up all the characters a little, but I think it makes the largest difference with Rickon. Natalia Tena as Osha, the wildling who is captured by Robb Stark in the fight in the woods and brought back to serve as a captive and servant at Winterfell, was perhaps the character that's the biggest change from the way I wrote her in the books. When I looked at the initial auditions for the part of Osha, you see a still picture first when you go to these casting sites, and you click on it and the tape plays. And just looking at Natalia's picture, of course, I recognized her as Tonks from Harry Potter. And I said, no, she's all wrong for the part. She's much younger than Osha. She's written in the book. She's much more attractive the way Osha is written in the books. And then I clicked on her picture and she began to play her audition. And she was just wonderful. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was perhaps not the character as I had originally written, but in fact, she was a much more interesting character than I had originally written, and one that I suddenly wanted to write about. People have asked me occasionally if the existence of the television show will impact the books. And for the most part, I think the answer is no. I'm going to write the books the way I've always intended to write the books. I have a pretty good idea of where I'm going, but there may be some influences in minor cases, and Osha is one of those cases. She's become such an interesting character in the TV show that when she reappears in the books, I'd really like to give her a more interesting role to play than I had perhaps originally had in mind. John Bradley West and Kit Harington as Sam and John. They have a marvelous dynamic going on there. I've asked sometimes if Sam was modeled after Sam from Lord of the Rings, and, not directly, but there's maybe a bit of that. John Bradley West is another incredible actor that Nina Gold discovered for us. Straight out of drama school, no previous professional work. In fact, I understand that when he auditioned for the role of Sam, it was the first professional audition he'd ever done. And of course, he gets this role, which is a fairly plum role, so it's a little bit of a fairy tale for John, but he's doing a magnificent job, I think. The scene is pretty much similar to the scene in the books, except for the setting. In the books, this meeting takes place at Moat Calan, which is a ruined castle surrounded by swamps. We've simplified it here. But although the setting has changed, the thrust of the scene is pretty much the same. One of the things I was pleased with that we were able to do, which the scene reflects, is the idea of some strategy going on with this war. It's a pet peeve of mine as someone who's a fan of fantasy and historical fiction and these things also as they're seen in movies and television, that in too many movies and television shows, when they're doing a war or a battle, all you see is two armies lined up on opposite sides of the field, and then they rush at each other and begin hacking and slashing. There's so seldom any sense of everything that goes into a campaign, the logistics of it, the difficulties of feeding the army, the question of high ground, flanking the enemy, of surprising the enemy, all of the stuff that Sun Tzu wrote about in The Art of War, all of the things that actual generals and commanders have to do. I wanted to give some sense of it, both in the books and in the television show. So in this whole first campaign here, deception and geography are a huge part of what's going on. Where the river is, where the armies are, taking the enemy by surprise. And we're able to get a sense of that in this brief scene, and that pleased me greatly, pleased me no end. And this is a beautiful scene, too, I think, between Rob and his mother. The dynamic when they first meet, where clearly they want to embrace each other, but Rob has to be very careful of how he's perceived by his men. He can't look like a mommy's boy. He's their leader. He's their lord, so long as Ned remains a captive. He's leading them to war, and in this very sexist and masculinist society, he's got to come across as macho, so they wait until the lords have left before they actually embrace, which was perfect, beautiful staging. This is a scene which I think works well, but it's one of those impacted by the budget. Of course, in my first draft of the script and in the books, everybody here is on a horse. They're not actually walking out of the mountains. There's a large force of people who are riding out of the mountains. But I guess we exhausted our horse budget, so the characters are on foot instead. And I love the Lannister camp with the red tents. Beautifully imagined, tells, which army this is instantly without having to have a voiceover or a label on the screen. You see the banners and you see the color of the tents and you know who you are. Here's Lord Tywin himself, Charles Dance, another actor who we really wanted, our leading choice for this role. I'm very pleased to have gotten him. That's a wonderful line. It's not one I can actually take credit for. I believe in the books, Tyrion says, "This is Bronn, son of no one in particular." And that was the line as I wrote it in my first draft. It got changed along the way. I don't know if that was actually an ad lib by Jeremy Flynn or whether David and Dan changed that line in rewrites, but it's one of the cases where I think they improve things. I wish I had thought of that line. That was very funny. Tyrion, of course, has been walking through the mountains, so he doesn't know any of this stuff. The staging of the scene, I think, is terrific. The way Tyrion keeps reaching for the wine, and his father, of course, who disapproves of his drinking and his whoring, keeps denying him the wine without a word being said about it. It's just physical action. And now I don't know if the director, Dan Minahan, added that when he blocked the scene, whether it's something the actors contributed himself, whether David and Dan put in some stage directions in a later draft of the script. But whoever added it, it's a beautiful riff, and it's great to have it in there. Just a little character moment between two men without a word being spoken. And Tyrion gets to wine at last. A little strange here that Shaga seems smaller than Lord Tywin, because Shaga is very large. But here he's got Tibbet standing next to him. He's even larger. And once again, we're getting a sense of strategy and the problems of warfare, strategy, tactics, maneuvering the armies, dealing with where the enemy is and trying to take him by surprise. The introduction of the phrase, a little backstory. There's a lot of backstory in my books. The story picks up, but it's not necessarily at the beginning. The things that happened 15 years ago, the things that happened 300 years ago, the things that happened thousands of years ago still have bearing on what's happening in the present, which is a real challenge for the screenwriters to get in all of this backstory. As a novelist, I have advantages that a screenwriter doesn't have. I have tools like internal monologue, unreliable narrator. I have the whole point of view technique. But the screenwriter has different tools at his disposal, and you have to make adjustments to use the weapons that you're given. Now, Rob, of course, is being very clever here. He's letting the scout go, but the scout has an inflated idea of the size of Rob's army, and Rob is now about to give him the wrong impression about what he's going to do with that army. So he's going to return to the Lannisters with bad information, which is exactly what Rob wants. So this is what I'm trying to get into. This whole sense of a chess game going on, a chess game played with armies and with human pieces. The great John. is loyal, but not as quick as he might be. He doesn't understand what Rob's done here. So, Janos Slint, commander of the City Watch, who was instrumental in Ned's fall, is being rewarded for his treachery from the Stark viewpoint, loyalty from the Lannister viewpoint. Sebaristan Selmy, played by Ian McElhinney. Sebaristan, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, most honorable knight in the kingdom, but one who formerly served House Targaryen before Robert's rebellion, and who was a reluctant participant in what just happened to the Starks. So the Lannisters are moving him aside here. Part of the reason that Sebaristan is being moved out is because the Kingsguard, the order of sworn brothers who protect the king, is traditionally made up of only 7 men. And Joffrey wishes to reward the Hound, Sandor Clegane, by making him one of the Kingsguard. But before he can do that, he has to make a vacancy, lose one of the current 7, and especially the Lord Commander. So this allows them to make Jaime Lannister Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and to make Sandor Clegane a Knight of the Kingsguard. Now, of course, there are many more than 5 men in the scene, but the 5 he's referring to there is the 5 other members of the Kingsguard. He is the 6th, and Jaime, who is off, is the 7th. And Sansa's big moment, a scene that takes considerable courage from her, and I think beautifully acted by Sophie here. Pycelle is still stuck in his bad cop role. He's trying to ingratiate himself. Pycelle's sort of a lick spittle. Jack Gleason, again, is another marvelous discovery for us. He's really a very nice young man. I met him when the first time I visited the set, and he was charming and friendly. And I wrote him after the first few episodes aired and said, "Congratulations, Jack, on your marvelous performance. Everyone hates you now." And I think it's true. Joffrey is universally loathed, and that's a testament to Jack's acting abilities. And there's the rub, of course. Beautiful final shot, I thought, with the prongs of the throne coming up to obscure Sansa, the sharp prongs of the throne made of swords of fallen enemies, weapons of death and destruction, with all the symbolism that that carries with it. So there we go, the pointy end. Thanks for listening, folks.